Edward Doughton, and he has written this book, Duke of York, Father of American Slave Society. And it basically traces the creation of and the details of America's slave society, and it talks about its impact throughout history. There's also an associated video here that I highly recommend everybody watch. You can go to this website, dukeyork.org. I've also linked it in the event description on my events calendar on my website, dukeyork.org. And this is a totally free book to download and to watch the video. And I'm going to go ahead and let our guest today tell you more about it. So without any further ado, welcome to the Contraband Wagon, Edward Doughton. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Feel honored, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. So am I. So let's just jump right into it then. So I kind of wanted to start a little bit by telling everybody how we actually got into contact with each other. First of all, actually, before I even do that, I want to explain to the audience. You'll notice that we're not seeing Edward's face on the screen, right? So I want anyone to understand that if you do apply to be a guest on this show and have a conversation with me, you can be anonymous. That is perfectly fine. There is no issue with that whatsoever. So do sign up if you're worried about anonymity. Do not be. This is exactly how it will be for you. Now, so with that said, let's talk about the impetus for the Duke of York, Father of America's Slave Society. Now, if I'm correct, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you kind of were at the end of your career, you were retiring, and you started learning a lot about slavery, American slavery, and some of the details, specifically some of the specific brutalities that existed within American slavery. And it seems to have piqued your interest that you have decided to spend your retirement writing a book about it. So why don't you tell us about your journey?
Well, sure. I'll be happy to do that. I got involved with this about 2 or 3 years ago. I saw a sign outside of an Episcopal church that said, "Join us in the conversation about race." And so I made contact with the father, and I went in and I met with him, and I talked with him about it. And he had been having some conversations, and interestingly, he had been meeting with some people who were members of a group called the Sons of the Confederacy. And they kept telling him that slavery was as bad in the North as it was in the South. And I thought, well, that's very interesting. And it happened to come at a time when I was really deciding to wrap up my career. I'm almost 80 years old. I had wanted to keep on working. I could keep on working actually today, as it turns out, but I bumped into some health issues, and I felt it wasn't fair to my clients for me to continue, and so I decided to retire. But I'm not the kind of guy to want to sit on my hands. I would be very unhappy, and so this happened about the time I had the conversation with the father at the Episcopal Church, and I began doing a little bit of checking, and sure enough, I found out that there was a lot that happened in the North that I never knew anything about. And then as I dug deeper, I found out there was a lot I didn't know about slavery in general. And I began becoming more and more interested in it. My education was in schools in a southern state about 60 years ago, a little bit more than that. And I was taught there was slavery, but that was it. I didn't know a lot about what happened. And I will go into some of the details as we go on with the conversation, Will. I actually have been not just surprised, I've been shocked I, I've been shocked. And I say that just so people know where I'm coming from on this. Um, I'm not, I mean, politically, I'm not a liberal, I'm not a conservative, I'm not a Republican, I'm not a Democrat. I consider myself to be pretty much middle of the road. I'm liberal on some issues, I'm conservative on others. Usually I end up being somewhere in the middle. Uh, but but I don't have any uh, uh, anything to push me forward to try to make a point. I just wanted to investigate the truth. And once I began finding out what happened, I realized that certainly I had not been taught about it. I began asking a lot of other people about it, and I found out that they had not been taught about it. Uh, One or two people said they had, but most people said they had not when I began asking them questions. And so I thought, well, this is a good opportunity to put information together. And so I did. And I'm continuing my research. I don't hold myself out as an expert on slavery. I'm relying instead on academic historians who are well respected. I'm relying on slave narratives, books written by people like Frederick Douglass, books about Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, William Wells Brown, and a lot of other people. And they are consistent in what they talk about slavery. There is not substantial disagreement about what happened, and it's pretty surprising.
Okay, well, I think you've given us a really good kind of summary of how this project came into being. Um, let's get into some of the details in the book. Let's just go ahead and jump right into it. So, why don't you start by telling us what was some of the most surprising, or maybe some of the first surprising information that you learned about slavery through your research?
Well, the I mean, one thing that just stands out to me, uh, and I almost use this as a test about whether anybody knows much about slavery, and that is, what is a coffle? It's spelled Coffle. I'd never heard of a coffle. I mean, I can't believe that I was well into my late 70s and I had never heard of a slave coffle. Uh, and when I found out what it was, I didn't. I thought, this can't be true. I mean, this cannot have happened. Uh, uh, and yet it did. It not only happened, it happened on a daily basis. It happened. It happened in front of tens of thousands of people, and and it really, to me, is almost a test about whether a school is teaching about slavery. Do they tell what a slave coffle is? Uh, uh,
So,
I,
why didn't you expand on that a little bit for the audience here? I know what a slave coffle is. I learned about what it was maybe about 5 years ago, as I was reading a book by a former Cornell professor. The half has never been told. Now, I learned that from a very advanced academic-y type book. And I'm sure that you probably did too, as you were doing research for your book. So I'm sure that there's a lot of people out there who never learned what a slave coffle is. So why don't you go into a little bit of detail for us and explain to them, first of all, what it is, and second of all, why it had the impact on you that it did, and why you chose that idea of slavery, of the coffle, to to distinguish between those who are teaching slavery as it actually existed and those who are maybe teaching a more sanitized version.
all right. Well, you said something that I want to bring out and I want to point out. You said you didn't know what a coffle was until about 5 years ago. Now, how old are you? You're in your probably late 30s. Um, you went to school in an American school, 5 K to 12. You're obviously well educated. You did not know what a slave couple was. I am very well educated. I have an education that is near, it's one of the best. And I never heard of a slave couple. So let me talk about what it was and uh, give you some description. Now, I read, I mean, one of the first things had to happen was I was reading Frederick Douglass's speech, the famous speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July. And by the way, if you're doing readings, I recommend that for a reading.
Absolutely,
Uh,
that's in the queue
uh,
for sure.
uh, and, and I thought, okay, well, he's talking about this, but what was it? And um, I'll describe it, and then I will talk about how frequent it was and how well known it was.
Go for it.
Um, uh, when after the invention of the cotton gin um, in 1793, I believe, uh, the uh, the America's emphasis on slavery really changed. Uh, the lower Mississippi Delta and other parts in the Deep South uh, were excellent for raising cotton. Until the cotton gin had been invented, it was a lot of trouble and a lot of cost. Uh, Cotton cloth was in very high demand, but the cotton gin changed everything. And over the years after the cotton gin was invented, in the upper South, which was Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, a lot of, I mean, I almost was surprised to find out that there were slaves in Maryland. I mean, that's how ignorant I was. I thought of Maryland as being a northern state, but it was a border state. It was in the Union. It didn't secede, but Maryland was a slave state. Delaware was a slave state. New Jersey was a slave state. They had slaves in New Jersey until the late 1940s. People don't know that. Um, uh, uh, the uh, after the cotton gin was invented, and the tobacco crops that were being raised in Maryland and Virginia especially began to dwindle. The tobacco market was not as good. The planters began finding they didn't have as much of a market, and it was they weren't making the money, and so they had excess slaves, and but the people in the Deep South needed slaves. Dr. Peter Colchin, who was at the University of Delaware, said that more than 1 million slaves were forced to migrate from the upper South and from the far East Coast in the lowlands of Carolina and so on to the Deep South. And this happened in a variety of ways. A lot of them were on ships, but a lot of them had to walk. And but to get from Maryland and Virginia to New Orleans, they had to go 1,000 miles. And so slave traders in Maryland and Virginia would buy slaves and they would chain them together, hundreds of slaves at a time. They would chain them together and force them to walk 1,000 miles and whip them on the way, whether they had shoes or not, whether they had adequate clothing or not, regardless of the weather, whether it was sunny or rainy, if it was snowing or cold or windy, they didn't have shelter. They had to walk that 1,000 miles. They had to walk on dirt roads. They had to walk over mountains. They had to go through rivers and streams until they got to New Orleans, where they would be auctioned off. But these slaves were separated from their families. They left their families back in Maryland and Virginia. And this was a common event. this wasn't just some crazy thing that happened once in a while. I was reading this morning. There's a book called American Slavery as It Is, written by Theodore Weld. He collected anecdotes by people who gave their what they saw, and he quoted somebody who said, "Well, I recently in one day I saw 4 coffles, ranging from 200 to 350 slaves each." Um, so that's these people. They were driven. They were driven like cattle. We think about the cattle drives from Texas up to Kansas, and throughout my whole life, I wondered, you know, they forced those cattle to walk all the way from West Texas up to Kansas. That's not 1,000 miles. And that's not 1,000 miles. They forced these people to walk 1,000 miles. And if they didn't walk fast enough, they got whipped. And in the speech, what to the slave is the 4th of July, Frederick Douglass talks about that very bitterly. So that is one thing that surprised me. Another that surprised me was I just didn't understand that people would whip slaves hundreds of times. I didn't understand that they would be tied up to posts and whipped. I guess I had an understanding that somehow they compelled the slaves to work, but I didn't understand how brutally they compelled them to work, how much they drove them. Sometimes, if they were angry enough, they would whip a slave to death. They would give 500 lashes. There are a number of instances of that happening. And it didn't matter if they whipped them to death. There was no punishment. It was technically illegal, but nobody ever was prosecuted for it. So I didn't understand that. I didn't understand the mechanism by which slaves were forced to stay on a plantation, that they had to have written passes to go off the plantation. And there were patrols looking for them. And any white person could stop them and demand their pass. And if they refused or if they resisted, the white person had the right to kill them. It was that brutal. I just didn't, it brought it all home. If you look back on it, it makes sense. I guess, not sense in the, as if it was a wise thing to do, but I guess they had to do something to keep them on the plantation. Otherwise, they're going to run away, as a lot of them did up in Maryland and a little bit less in Virginia. So I was surprised by that. I was surprised to learn about what happened in New York. One of the things, one thing that stands out to me is that there were precedents in America in the territory that became America. There were slave societies that existed before the American Slave Society really took off. In New York, the Dutch, until they were defeated by the Duke of York in 1664. There was a major change in the English government in 1660. The monarchy was restored. King Charles II became king. His brother, James Stuart, became Duke of York, and he was in charge in New York. He defeated the Dutch in New York. The Dutch slaves, the Dutch allowed slaves to own property. They could live with their families. They could earn incomes. They could participate in religious services. They had access to courts. They actually could sue and win against white people. None of that remained after the Duke of York took over after 1664. That was all eliminated. There was slavery in Virginia. Everybody hears about the 1619 project. Well, there were captives who were brought in down in southern Virginia, down to Point Comfort near Jamestown. But those slaves achieved freedom after a period of years, approximately 7, depending on the slave, give or take a year or two. They could earn income, they could own property, their families were respected, they could participate in economic life. Uh, all of that, all of that was possible. But again, after 1660, it changed because the monarchy was now in control. There was another region where we had a precedent, and that's Spanish Florida. The same pattern. Slaves could earn their freedom. They could own property. They could have families. But Florida had something else, and that was it was a haven for escaped slaves. We hear a lot about the Underground Railroad and slaves going north from Maryland and Virginia up in a little bit from Kentucky through Ohio up into Canada. Well, slaves went from Carolina and Georgia down into Florida. And once they got there, if they converted to Catholicism, they would be given freedom. Well, I think that's a no-brainer. I'd convert immediately. And not only that, the Spanish gave them their own towns. There were towns of free black citizens. They were citizens of Florida, and they had a militia of 1,000, up to 1,000 warriors, guerrilla warriors, and they actually had a war. The slave holders from Georgia and Carolina attacked them. It was you don't hear about this in school. This happened in 1812, but it wasn't the War of 1812. It happened at the same time. America had 2 wars going on. One was against the British, and the other was down in Florida against the free blacks and the Native Americans who were working with the free blacks. But there was a guy named Juan Bautista Whitten, who was one of the black guerrillas, and he led an army of black guerrilla warriors and Native Americans ambushing the U.S. Army troops who were supporting the slaveholders. They came down to Florida and supported the slaveholders with the knowledge of the president and the Secretary of State. And they ambushed them and beat them. And that ended that particular war. But Andrew Jackson came back later and caused more trouble. So those are a few of the things I learned. But up in New York, after the Duke of York took over, and I said that he'd made the change from the Dutch slavery. Now we had a form of slavery that was especially brutal. It didn't follow the model of the Dutch. It didn't follow the Spanish model. It didn't follow the model in Virginia that existed before 1660. And he enacted some of the basic laws, excuse me, that became the pattern for American slavery. These included hereditary slavery. The children of a slave mother automatically were slaves. Slavery became a lifetime event. They couldn't get their freedom, at least not easily. So those children who were born to a slave mother automatically were slaves for life. This is where the passage became required. They were forbidden to meet in large groups because the whites were terrified. That's one of the themes that runs through American slavery, is that the white citizens were terrified of African Americans. The slaves could revolt, and some did. They could run away. They could fight back. And so the response was, rather than trying to recognize their humanity and allow them to have their families, they no longer were allowed to marry. They couldn't marry. They could have families, but they weren't legally recognized. and they were broken up easily. Uh, and in New York, they began to use really atrocious brutality in the late 1600s into the early 1700s and on further into 1700s. For example, after a slave revolt in 1712 in New York City, dozens of slaves were burned at the stake. They were broken on the wheel. They were gibbeted, which means they were hung up in cages to die. Uh, uh, One slave was roasted slowly over a fire for hours in order to increase his suffering. That's what they did in New York. And New York remained, with the Duke of York, New York became a center of the slave trade, and it remained a center of the slave trade all the way through the 1700s into the 1800s. After the international slave trade was made illegal in 1808, New York continued as a center for slave trading, which the Portuguese created a little colony inside New York City, and they bought ships and used the ships to haul slaves from Africa to Cuba and Brazil. And New York was a slave center for that. But New York also provided banking services, insurance services, commodity trading services, shipping services, all of which were needed by the Southern planters. They didn't have those facilities in the South. And without them, without New York City, they could not have succeeded. It was so important, slavery was so important in New York that when the South began seceding from the Union, the mayor of New York City proposed that New York City secede with the South. That's how important slavery was to New York City. So, and I probably omitted something. New York City is named in honor of the Duke of York, who brought all these laws into effect. When he defeated the Dutch in New York, he defeated them in Africa also. He was also the admiral of the English Navy. And when he defeated them in Africa, he gained control of the slave prisons and slave trading relationships. So he could buy slaves and ship them to the English colonies. It wasn't just America, it was also other colonies in the Caribbean. And he did it through a government entity called the Royal African Company, which was a slave trading monopoly for the English colonies. And so when he bought slaves in Africa and brought them here and sold them, he made profits. But they did more than that. They did more than that. I talked about the laws he enacted, the hereditary slave laws. Another law was to focus slavery on Africans, prohibit slavery of Native Americans, limit whites to indentured servitude. So this hereditary lifetime status was only for Africans. But he encouraged, he and King Charles II encouraged the colonists, not just in America, but other English colonies, to buy slaves. When they bought slaves, the government gave land to the slaveholders. In Virginia, for every slave, they got 50 acres. So somebody who got 100 slaves could have 5,000 acres. On top of that, they got lower property taxes on the slaves and lower customs fees. So you say, why would the English government want to encourage slavery? And the answer is because the slaves produced commodities that were traded, and the English government taxed those commodities. So you have two sources of revenue to the government. One is taxes, and one is revenues from selling slaves. So those are a few of the things that I learned.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing all that. So, everything that you described is also stuff that I've learned through my own independent research. Of course, I didn't learn any of that in school. I learned it all from reading books, through, a similar situation to you. Um, you were surprised to learn about this stuff. So was I. But I wasn't surprised that I guess I wasn't surprised that I hadn't learned about it, right? Because I had an understanding of, what the education I did receive was, why it was kind of cultivated the way it was, and presented to me the way it was. One thing that you didn't mention about coffles that I do want to bring up for people so they have an understanding is about how they were actually chained, right? Because, I'm not sure what image people have in their minds when they think about a chain of men, women, and sometimes children, walking over rough terrain for thousands of miles in scant clothing sometimes pregnant women as well, going into labor like chained to a bunch of people and stuff like that. Um, so actually, there's two things about it I want to mention. One is how they were chained, right? They were chained at the neck, they were chained at the wrists, they were chained at the waist, and they were chained at the ankles. So they were chained in every which way you can imagine. And then some of them, even if they were being punished on the walk for whatever reason, right? Or simply through sadism, there was this metal cage for the head that they could also put on, sometimes in almost 100-degree heat, raining down on people. So absolutely, it was a brutal practice, a brutal migration. And a lot of abolitionists wrote about these coffles at the time that they were going on. And they said that one of the things that kind of helped their cause of abolition was that people saw these coffles. Just them seeing them in person, seeing these, like, hundreds of people chained together in the most terrible condition, walking down their streets, it changed a lot of people's minds about the utility of slavery and whether we should be continuing that practice.
Well, that's right. Well, just to talk about you, if you picture this, in Washington D.C., Alexandria, Virginia, was then part of Washington D.C., and then a little later it separated. But there's still a building there. The Price Birch and Company building is still there. They were the major slave traders, but they would chain them. And so going they're obviously walking down roads, and these roads go through towns. So they're going through town after town after town, state after state. There are people in all of these towns, hundreds of people in every town, in larger towns, thousands of people, who see these slaves walking down the middle of the street. There are reports. The book I referred to, American Slavery as It Is, by Theodore Weld, W-E-L-D. You could probably get it on Amazon. It's a very detailed book, but once you start reading the details, you almost can't put it down. People were. It talks about how members of Congress had to stand aside while slaves walked on the sidewalk and streets in front of the Capitol building. So they would go down through these towns, and as I said, the Appalachian Mountains are there. They had to go over the Appalachian Mountains. They had to cross rivers, all with all of these chains all over them, and it's probably a little hard for some people to picture the head cages you talked about. But they did use head cages. It wasn't just on the couples. They used them even more generally. And for you to get an image of this, for people who are listening, you might go to a website. I'll give you the name. It's slaveryimages.org. and they have public domain images, hundreds and hundreds of public domain images. Slaveryimages.org. It's well worth a look. And you will see head cages in there, and they have everything categorized by groups. But these collars and head cages, sometimes they would actually cover up the person's mouth so they couldn't eat. They would control the ability of the slave to eat as a means of punishment. If a slave was disobedient, might maybe try to run away, and so on. They had a wide variety of different types of devices that they would put around the neck and over the head. I never imagined such a thing, but obviously they did. There are quite a few images in slaveryimages.org about that. And of course, they branded slaves. I mean, keep in mind they were cattle. They were farm animals, and they got branded on the cheek, on the arm, on the shoulder, and you can get some descriptions of that. Charles Dickens wrote a book about America, and he published advertisements that slaveholders would put in newspapers saying that their slave had escaped, and there was a reward, and they would describe them. I mean, it was shameless. They would say, "Well, I was trying to make a letter M on the cheek, or they're missing an eye, or their hand is broken, or they have a chain around the ankle, or what, all sorts of injuries that these slaves had experienced in ad after ad after ad. And obviously, just as with slave couples, I mean, you walk this down through the center of Main Street and all these little towns, people saw it. They didn't object to it. They accepted it. It was a way of life. And the same thing with these ads. Of course, these slaves were injured and mutilated. Of course they were. They were slaves. There was no shame in it. It was done wide open, and nobody objected except people like Theodore Well. So you can read some of this. And by the way, other reading material, or I'll just mention our. I mentioned Douglas's speech. What to the Slave is the 4th of July. That's readily available online. You can actually find actors who are performing it, and it is a very touching speech. I can read a little bit of it to give you a flavor. And he wrote Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. That was his first book. He had to go to England after he wrote that, because then up until that point, he hadn't identified where he came from. He had been discovered by the abolitionists, and he became a celebrated orator. And this was at a time when oratory was one of the main forms of entertainment in America. One author likens it to a major sporting event. But he would speak to thousands of people. He would go into a little town and set up a box on the street corner or in a park and start talking. And by the time he was done, he would have thousands of people listening to him. He was that good. He was an unbelievable person. Just I'll come back to him. But I mentioned, probably if you're going to read one book by him, I would recommend one called My Bondage and My Freedom. I think that's the best one. There's a later one called Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, which gets into some things after the enactment of the Civil War amendments to the Constitution. But if you really want to read just about slavery, My Bondage and My Freedom is a very readable book. He's a great author, and it's easily readable, and you can get it immediately on Amazon for about $7 or $8. Um,
And for those of you who are just joining us, don't forget, we are talking with the author of this publication that you can get for 100% free on dukeyork.org. That's DUKEYORK.org. And you can download the book for free under the conditions listed on the website. And there's an accompanying video as well for you to check out. Sorry, Edward, go ahead.
that's quite all right. Now, one thing that we haven't talked about that I think is important to talk about because, um, again, this is information I never learned in school. There were, it's important to distinguish what's called the international slave trade from the internal slave trade. Now, I've been describing slave coffles, which were part of the internal slave trade, and they really emerged, especially after 1808, because the international trade became illegal. That didn't mean it stopped; it just means it was illegal. Um, the international trade was indescribable. I
Still with me? You all right?
All right, just give me a minute.
All right.
I am so angry about what happened. I am so angry.
So am I, my man. I mean, like, what can I say? There's a reason why black people are always caricatured as angry. There's a reason, um, so your anger is well understood, my man.
All right. So they would, they would, the slave traders were Africans in Africa. And you didn't really have a lot of whites going over in a ship, jumping off the ship, grabbing a bunch of people and making a run for it. That's not what happened. Uh, there were organized slave traders in Africa. It could be as a result of a war. It could be a family dispute, whatever. But they would the images and slaveryimages.org of the marching these people across the African continent to get to the coast with tree branches around their necks. Their necks forked between in tree branches to hold them together, and chains. And then they would be held in the prisons sometimes for months, and and they were desperate people. Many of them committed suicide, and then they would be taken on the ships and put down in holds that were so tight. They were so tightly packed that they generally separated the women from the men, which just made the women vulnerable to rape by the crews. And the men had to sleep spoon fashion, head to toe, head to toe, head to toe. And they didn't have room to stand up. And they were like this for months. And and the bathroom facilities, of course, were virtually non-existent, almost impossible to get to. The filth was unbelievable. They would bring people up on deck and force them to dance for exercise because the captain wanted to keep them alive. But if somebody started getting sick, well, they'd throw them overboard. The sharks were trailing the ships. The estimate is that the most conservative estimate that I've seen is that 5 million people died, either immediately before, during what's called the Middle Passage, or shortly after landing from disease and bad treatment. Other estimates go up into the tens of millions. W.B. Du Bois has estimates of 50 to 60 million died. That's a genocide. So in America, the word genocide means something terrible. In the book, I compare what happened in the international trade to several genocides that happened during the 21st century. And the numbers of Africans who died exceed all but maybe one of them. And you can guess which one that is. But this was a genocide. I was never taught that there was a genocide in the international trade. Now, not America only got a small percentage of the slaves that were brought over in this way, but it was enough to populate the slaves here. This was just part of the larger operation. But that is what happened. I mean, the stories about what they did to people, how they would punish people on a ship without mercy. I mean, you can use your imagination for the most horrible thing you can imagine, and it was done. But here in America, the Americans didn't treat the slaves a whole bunch better in many cases. I talked about New York in 1712, where they burned people at the stake, and you can say, oh, well, that was, let's say, that's what, 60 years before the Declaration of Independence. Well, how about 1830, when slaves were burned at the stake in Virginia, or not Virginia, South Carolina, and the slave was burned at the stake in St. Louis, Missouri, and Poughkeepsie, New York. And there was a slave revolt in Virginia in 1830, the Nat Turner Revolt. There was a suspected conspiracy in North Carolina the same year. In 1811, there was another revolt. In every one of those cases, what they did after they killed the slaves was to post their heads on stakes and put the stakes along public roads. Now, that can only be for one reason. It can't be to punish the slaves, they're already dead. It's to terrorize. This was a terror technique. And it was in 1830, which was more than half a century after the Declaration of Independence. All right. And there are two people who claim to have seen in the 2000s a purse in Southern Virginia on display made from the skin of Nat Turner. Henry Gates says his body was dismantled in that manner. Henry Gates is Dr. Henry Gates of Harvard. Dr. Henry Gates says that that's true. He doesn't specifically say about the purse, but he talks about them taking Nat Turner's body apart in that manner. This is what happened. This is how bad it was for those people. So
yeah, we've definitely got some shocked reactions here in the chat. Like, I think that a lot of people are unaware of this level of brutality that you're talking about, or that it was widespread and sustained for as long as it was. We have a question here I want to posit to you, Edward, by Generator Creative. It says, Edward, why do you think this information is withheld from being taught in schools? Why are America's slave heroes not recognized as, say, Abraham Lincoln?
Well, that's a good question. Um, I will tell you, if you look at the movie, if you watch the movie on the website, we quote a number of textbooks, uh, and we quote an author named Margaret Rutherford. Margaret Rutherford wrote in about 1919, 1920, and basically what she said was, she's this is when the lost cause ideology really began to take hold. After you understand, after the Civil War, there was a period of Reconstruction. We got the Civil War amendments, 13th Amendment, slavery was abolished, and then the 14th Amendment, equal protection and due process, and the 15th Amendment, voting. And that's the point in 1870 when I say that America became a nation. That's when the Declaration of Independence was put into law. But after Reconstruction, the South reasserted itself, and African Americans were forced into working relationships that echoed slavery through a variety of laws known as black codes. I'll describe some in Mississippi, and I'm going to answer the question, but I'm trying to give you some background. That every African American had to have employment. They had to have a contract for employment, and if they were not employed, they could be arrested as vagrants and put into prison. Now, there's an exception in the 13th Amendment that abolishes slavery, except for people who are prisoners. And so when you hear about people working in prisons, they can be legally enslaved, and so but if an African American left that contract, they could be arrested and taken back to their employer. But they got forced into these sharecropping arrangements where they would get a piece of land to raise a crop, but they had to share with the white owner of the land, and the white owner of the land would determine essentially how much the black farmer got. Just to show how ironclad that was, in 1919 in Elaine, Arkansas, the sharecroppers tried to organize a union so they could get more money, and they were gunned down. Hundreds were killed. This was about the same time as the Tulsa massacre. You hear about Tulsa, but you don't hear about Elaine. And the Elaine massacre, much of it was conducted by federal troops who used machine guns to kill the demonstrating black farmers. Who was president? The president was Woodrow Wilson, the first Southern president after the Civil War. He was a segregationist. He segregated federal offices. The bathrooms, the lunch, the cafeterias, the work areas, the offices were segregated. He had segregationists in his cabinet. This is the same time that Tulsa's happening and Elaine happens. This is when Margaret Rutherford wrote her book, and she said, reject any book that says that the slaveholder was cruel to his slaves. That's one of the things. Reject any book that says that the South seceded because of slavery. And you find the same kinds of things 50 years later in Virginia. There are books in Virginia that we quote in the movie that you can watch on Duke of York. Duke York, it's not Duke of York, it's dukeyork.org. And you'll see that it's in Virginia, it says the slaves were happy. They loved their masters. There's a Texas the Texas book in there too. Uh, and I'm just going by my own experience. I know what I was taught and what I was not taught. You telling me that your experience will is similar. Um, this people don't want to know that don't want to know this. A lot of people don't want to know this. But here's the thing: I I don't believe we can have. I don't believe we can get together as a people until we understand what happened. There's a reason why African Americans are angry. They are talking through their families, generation to generation to generation. In the white families, we don't hear about it. In the black families, they do. Uh, in the movie, there's a young man named Carlton Calhoun, and he says, I was born in 1973. When I was 4 or 5, I was raised by a great aunt, and her parents were slaves. That's how. This was not that long ago. The way I express it is, it was 2 lifetimes ago. All right. So I'm 80. But so if you go back to 1940, somebody who was 80 then was born during the Civil War. That's 2 lifetimes ago. This is not very long ago, but there was a concerted effort to try to bury this information. The South believed that it was right. It believed that slavery was right. You can read speeches by people like John C. Calhoun about.
I mean, at this point, you could just go on TikTok, and there's people still talking about the fact that slavery was a good idea. So, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, you can read John C. Calhoun. He made a speech on the Senate floor about how great slavery was and how lucky Africans were to be here instead of being over in Africa. And a lot of people believed it. And so you have these changes where for a short period, about 10 years, Reconstruction, and then after that, it was so bad. It was so bad for African Americans that there have been something like 5,000 lynchings that have been documented. And somebody sent me a link and asked me to watch a movie, and I got into it and I just couldn't finish it. I had to turn it off. I mean, they would just do it with crowds of people around. Clearly, crowds of people around. There's a famous case back in the early 1900s or late 1890s. A young woman, her husband was falsely accused. Somebody did something, and I can't remember if somebody killed a white person or not, but her husband was not guilty. But they were rounding up African men to lynch, and she protested. She said she was going to go to the authorities. They took her, tied her. She was pregnant. They tied her upside down, cut her open, and stomped her baby to death and let her hang there and die in front of a crowd of people. This is what happened. And you say, well, this can't happen today. Well, as I said, but now that we have smartphones, it's going to be a lot harder. And smartphones have really changed the conversation. But people don't want to talk about this. And I'm not saying I'm not trying to throw all this out and say, oh well, white people ought to go around feeling guilty about no. I think what we just need to do is understand why African Americans are upset and have some understanding. And I don't think we can do that until we know what happened.
And I just want to go off that point right there because I think that's a great point. It really all depends on your approach with this issue. Ultimately, why I created the Contraband Wagon and why we do these shows is to kind of build that kind of empathy that you were implying there, right? Which is, we need people to understand Black American history, specifically the history of slavery and the brutality that the American despotic government just enforced on the community for so long. And I think when people, for instance, see an Olympic athlete, for instance, at the U.S. trials turned away from the flag, or when you see Kaepernick take a knee or something at a football game or something like that, it's important that people understand that there's a long legacy that has led directly to those actions. And I think it's exactly what you said. In the Black community, most of us are aware of that history, right? And those people who came before us protesting and fighting for their freedom and their human dignity. But obviously, there's a different relationship to those events that a lot of the white community has, if they're aware of them at all.
Well, I agree with that. And you made a point. You used the phrase despotic government. This was official government policy. It was official national government policy. Um, I, I, I'll, I'll come back later and talk about some of the founding fathers, but the every pre, something like 12 of the first 18 presidents owned slaves for something like 49 out of the first 61 years of American history. Now, very early on, there was one guy named John Adams who did not own slaves. He was I think, the second president. His son, John Quincy Adams, did not own slaves. But you've got presidents who own hundreds of slaves, and, and I'll come back to them. But if you look at American history, you find every presidential election turning on slavery as a major issue. You have every major event, the annexation of Texas, the annexation of Florida, the Louisiana Purchase, after the annexation of Texas, the Mexican-American War, then the Missouri Compromise, the Kansas-Nebraska bill, where Kansas was a little civil war. I can describe that. It's pretty remarkable. And then you have the Dred Scott decision of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court rendered several important decisions. One of them was the decision that said that a slaveholder from Maryland could go into Pennsylvania, which was not a slave state, and capture an escaped slave and take that person back with their free child back to Maryland. And the Supreme Court upheld that. But in Dred Scott, what the Supreme Court said was that a slave did not have access to the courts because African Americans were not citizens, and only citizens could bring cases into Supreme Court. But what that meant was not just that a slave was not a citizen, the people who were supposedly free African Americans were not citizens. And indeed, on one of his trips to England, when Frederick Douglass wanted to go to France and asked the American minister for a passport, he was denied on the grounds that he wasn't a citizen. And that was after his freedom had been purchased. So Dred Scott you've got the Supreme Court, you've got presidents who are winking and looking the other way at the illegal slave trade, international trade. And you have all of these major events that turn on slavery. It pervaded all of American history. The Constitution had had significant clauses that recognized slavery. Uh, uh, and so all of these things, and one of those clauses was the fugitive slave clause, which said that if a slave escaped from one state into another, this is I talked about the Supreme Court decision. Then they should the free states should return the slaves, and the northern states resisted and resisted, and so in 1850, a new fugitive slave law was enacted that mandated every citizen of every state to assist in the capture of fugitive slaves. And it created commissioners who would, the officials of the states had to take the slaves before a commissioner, and the commissioner got $10 for every slave they sent back. But if they decided that the slave was not the person was not a slave, they only got $5. That you have to adjust for inflation there, so that doesn't sound like a lot of money today, but it was a lot of money then. They got paid double if they sent the slave back. So people who ran the Underground Railroad were violating the law. And in fact, another Supreme Court decision held that an abolitionist in Ohio was liable to a slaveholder in Kentucky for assisting that slaveholder's slave in escaping, and it bankrupted the abolitionist. That's how pervasive this was and how dominant they were. The Supreme Court was clearly moving in the direction, and Lincoln's election stopped this, but it was moving in the direction of saying that slaveholders would have a right to take their property into non-slave states and keep their property there, and then essentially to spread slavery over the entire country. The Supreme Court was moving in that direction, and there was actually a case in the judicial system that would have tested that. But Lincoln's election cut that short, and the South seceded instead. So now let's go back to the founders a little bit, because there's some interesting.
All right, hang on. Before you get into the founders, Edward, I'm gonna
Right, yeah.
put a pause in here. So we had a comment here from Notarobot saying that white people are severely undereducated about this, at least the ones I talked to. I just want to say, for everyone who hasn't watched my Ask Me Anything video on my YouTube channel, you can check that out. It's the Contraband Wagon to check that out. But I talked about the fact that I've been having conversations on race with strangers for the last 3 decades, basically. And I found that as well. Okay, but there's another layer that I just want to kind of throw in here. It's not quite related to the topic at hand, but I think it's important to highlight, which is that me, having been someone who was kind of taking charge of my own education about these issues, right? I was not believed when I would bring up the same kind of facts that Edward is bringing up today during this conversation, right? So there was some kind of an absolute bar there, right? Where I couldn't communicate with people about these issues and how their legacy spread because I wasn't believed about the facts of the matter at hand. And I think not being believed is also a consequence of slavery and racism and systemic racism in American society. And so it just goes to show that these consequences not only have a negative impact on the person in the time period and beyond, but also it curtails the possibility of a solution. And so that is something that we all need to be aware of, that the consequences are kind of self-reinforcing systemic racism as well. I just wanted to throw that in there, guys. So, Edward, you were talking about the founding fathers. So let's talk about them.
All right. And let me say, I tried very hard. Remember, I'm not an expert on slavery. I'm relying upon people who are professionals. And I tried very hard in the book to be accurate in terms of what they say. and you can you can I put the I don't use endnotes, I use footnotes, so you can see who I'm citing, uh, and and, uh, and you can read what we're talking about. Now, one of the things, and, before I go on the founders, one of the things I do in the book is I create stories. These are incidents that are related by people like Frederick Douglass, Solomon Northup. Those of you who know have heard about 12 Years a Slave, his stories that he tells, and I relate those as stories in the book. I take them sometimes, especially Solomon Northup, I have to go, you'll talk about a person on page 10, again on page 20, again on page 30. And then, so I take all those different parts and put them together. And you can see what happens to this person over a period of time and how their lives have been essentially ruined. Um, but uh, there are some stories that there are quite a few stories in there, and they give you a good feel for what happened in slavery. I talked about Charles Dickens and the ads, the runaway slave ads. Those are in there, and a lot of the witness accounts from Theodore Wells' book, American Slavery as It Is, are in there, as well as the work, relying on the work of the academic historians. Um, Now, here's this. This is kind of interesting, and it was I just I came across this today. Uh, there were five men who drafted the Declaration of Independence. Uh, One was somebody I'd never heard of, Roger Sherman. Another was John Adams. Neither of them owned slaves. Three of the others did. Those were Thomas Jefferson, Robert Livingston, and Benjamin Franklin. Uh, I like Benjamin Franklin. I'm going to give him credit. He didn't own a lot of slaves. He owned a couple. And he had very negative attitudes about the intellectual abilities of African Americans until he went to some schools. He went to some schools and he saw the students perform. And after he did that, over a period of time, he changed his mind and became the head of the Abolition Society in Philadelphia. So I'll give Ben, anybody who can change their mind.
Yeah,
Uh,
man. There's growth there. We got to celebrate growth,
uh,
definitely.
that's right. I mean, I'll give him credit. I want to save Thomas Jefferson. Uh, George Washington owned, with Martha, owned 300 slaves. Uh, he doesn't seem to have been one of the more vicious people, but nevertheless, he owned his slaves. He freed his slaves when he died. She did not free hers. But she actually was kind of crabby. And on the Mount Vernon website, you'll find her quoted as complaining that she says something like, "These blacks don't ever show gratitude for all the kindness we show them." You know, uh, they there are a couple of one story is about a slave that they had who well, but they would go up to Philadelphia for periods of time, and in Pennsylvania the law was Pennsylvania was not a slave state, but they allowed slaveholders to come in for 6 months. Uh, but if they held the slaves for more than 6 months, then the slaves were free. So what George and Martha did was they'd bring the slaves up, but before the 6 months expired, they'd send them back and bring some more up. But they had a young woman who found out that Martha was going to give her to her granddaughter as a wedding gift. I mean, you're talking about property here, folks, and was going to give her as a gift, and she just went out of the house at night and walked away at dinner time and got on a ship and went up to New England and went up into New Hampshire. And George kept trying to get her to come back, and she refused, but he wouldn't go. He wouldn't send people after her because then it wouldn't look good. So he didn't do that. But I, I, that is, I mean, it's amazing. I mean, Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death, owned hundreds of slaves. Can you imagine that? Give me liberty or give me death. And he owns hundreds of slaves.
I mean that says it all, doesn't it? Doesn't that say it all right there? Like, I mean, this level of hypocrisy, right? Like that we've been dealing with in this nation is coming to a head right now. I would love for you to talk a little bit about like how that hypocrisy that you're describing right there, right? Of like, you have all these slaves, but give me liberty or give me death, you know? Like, I mean, so aren't you just right there saying that, you know, I mean, it's the ultimate gaslighting and dehumanization right there, you know? And you see it kind of reflected in some attitudes that people have today towards basic education, like what you're trying to do for people about slavery, but also more generally about racism. So, how do you think that these attitudes that some of these founding fathers had has like translated through the ages, and so that it's still active now? Do you have any opinion on that?
Well, I think a lot of those guys, I uh, I don't want to make excuses for them because I mean there obviously were people who were not slaveholders. You know, they didn't have to be slaveholders. They grew up with it. It was their whole life. But they did what everybody around them was doing. Uh, and to a certain extent, they had the attitude at that time that slavery would die out. I think they thought that the Constitution provided for the international slave trade to be ended in 1808. And I think they thought that it was going to die out. Uh, some of them had that idea. You know, the cotton gin
You know,
changed.
whenever I read that, you know, I've read that before as well, you know, in my studies, and every time I read it, I have a real hard time believing that there was a genuine belief there, because of the business dealings all these guys were involved in and the political maneuvering. It's hard for me to believe that they actually thought that slavery would die out, given their position and their perspective uh, from that position. But like maybe I don't know. Maybe that was just like willful blindness that was
Well,
encoded.
let's talk about my granddaddy.
All right, let's
Not
go.
my granddaddy, but my granddaddy example. Not literally my granddaddy. And that's Thomas Jefferson. All right. So Thomas Jefferson owned 600 slaves. Uh, he uh, his wife had died. He had a long-term relationship with Sally Hemings, who was his slave, and she had 6 children. Well, those 6 children were his slaves. This, I mean, this was very, very, very common. You know, it was for a lot of slave mistresses, it was a, a source of deep anger because they go walking around the plantation and there are all these little bitty children who are not all that dark anymore, who look like the master. There's a reason for that. And so here's Thomas Jefferson. He's got 6 children by Sally Hemings. Now, one of the interesting stories about that is that she had she had actually, I don't know how she got to France, if she went with him or not, but she was in France, she was free.
I do believe that she did go with him.
Okay. Well, she was a teenager. She was about 16. She came back with him. She agreed to come back as a slave on the condition that he would free their children. And he did. He did free the children when he died. But get this, he had to have permission of the state legislature to do that. uh, they became very concerned about all these free black people running around because for a lot of reasons. One is they would help slaves escape. Another is they showed slaves that you could be free and get and do fine. Uh, and and, and the free African Americans uh, probably were not as respectful. Uh, so, but I mean, here's Thomas Jefferson, 600 slaves, and he writes his book, Notes on Virginia. Now, this just floors me. This just floors me. In his Notes on Virginia, he, people talk about how smart he was. It's like he was an idiot. It's like he was really dumb, really stupid. He was trying to figure out. He said, "Well, here are these people. They have this kinky hair and they smell bad, and I've never seen one that ever did anything intelligent and this kind of stuff. And he's got a relationship, the mother of his children. He's making all of these disparaging remarks in a book, highly racist remarks. It really, I mean, I've got to say, my opinion of Thomas Jefferson has really gone downhill a lot lately.
I mean, I've got to tell you though, Edward, we see that same thing. I've experienced the same thing in my life, right? Like where a white person will talk disparagingly about the black community, like to me. And then I'll be like, hey, like, I'm black, right? And then they'll be like, well, no, not you. Like, you're black. They're N-words. You're black. And so like I mean, I think trying to think about it logically is a mistake because, this is people who are partitioning their minds and living with all kinds of cognitive dissonance back then and now. And I think that, maybe the rules in which we evaluate stuff by don't necessarily apply as directly to this situation because we've let it rock for generations, and I think that we're kind of seeing the consequences of that now. But go on. Yeah, like so you learned all about Thomas Jefferson and the slaves. Also, you didn't learn that in your K through 12 education. That's correct.
No, I didn't know.
Yeah.
I mean, everything. I don't think I've said anything other than that there was slavery that I was told in school. I don't think any of this. I mean, this is all stuff that I have learned in the last 2 to 3 years, and I did my best. I mean, I do have the ability to write large pieces of written product, and I did, and it's lengthy, but it's broken down. You don't have to read it from start to finish. You can just pick up sections and read sections. So you can even download chapters. I have the website set up so you can download a chapter.
Yeah, everybody, you can take a look right here just to display it for our viewers here. You can see that you can download it chapter by chapter here. Intro to America's Slave Society, expressing that it was a terror society. The Duke of York, how he promoted slavery, as Edward talked about. Its slavery contradictions. The Duke of York slave trading legacy, his creation on a rampage, and then moving forward. I kind of want to transition here. Believe it or not, we've already been talking for 90 minutes. So we've got 30 minutes left here. And I'd like to transition a little bit to talking about moving forward. I think you've given us a pretty clear idea about the history now, about what you yourself personally didn't know, and what you believe a lot of people also didn't learn and know. So I guess my question now is, how do we move forward? What for you? Collecting this information, sharing it. Obviously, part of your intention is to educate people on this. But what about your general thoughts about everything going on right now? There's obviously a lot of pushback to education on race in general. So how do you think we can get people to I don't know, like maybe be motivated to learn it or be more interested in learning it or even recognize that there is something for them to learn. Because I find that the last one there, the recognition that you are ignorant of something, is a very difficult problem to deal with when I'm not wearing my mathematics teacher hat. So maybe you can help me with that.
Well, I mean, I'll just throw one thing out. I think one thing is to put aside the whole idea of race. Uh, I think it's a useless concept. It didn't come into being until the 14 or 1500s. It kind of evolved. Before that, or there were different different schools of thought, but not anything that was articulated as races of people. I don't think we're really that different. And and you know, a good example is I mean, how do you define who is African American anymore? How do you define who is white? I mean, it probably surprised people to know that there are a lot of white people running around who've got a good bit of African American blood in, and as well as a lot of African Americans running around. We've got a lot of other types of blood in them. I mean, I think it's a useless concept. Uh,
I mean,
and,
I don't think anyone can really argue against that, right? Since it was, I mean, at this point, I think that most people are in agreement that we need to get rid of racial categories as an ultimate goal. However, I think that getting from where we are now to that point is quite the journey and quite the road. So
well, in the book, I do point to some things that are occurring today that I think really are vestiges from slavery. I think some of the police behavior. I think in the incident down in Georgia where these guys chased down this fellow who was just jogging through a neighborhood and killed
yep,
him.
that's Ahmaud Arbery. Hmm.
Yeah. Um, you know, those are back during slavery when slaves got off the plantation and whites could challenge them and they were expected to be obedient and they were expected to be submissive and uh, and the whites could take action against them. You know, I think there's some attitudinal vestige there, and uh, the I really see it in education. Uh, I, as I say in the movie, African Americans have never had equal educational opportunities. They just haven't. Uh, it's a disaster. It it I don't understand why we don't say this is a national emergency. The statistics, American schools in general are sinking. It's getting worse and worse and worse for all students.
That's absolutely
Whereas
right.
around 1970, American schools tended to rate in, at the top of the heap internationally. Now, for example, uh, in the ranking last year, uh, in reading, United States is 12th. In math, we're 25th. In science, we're 20th. Um, Countries that rank ahead of America in all three areas, reading, math, and science, include Poland, Macau, Liechtenstein, Hungary and Czech Republic, and Slovak Republic rank ahead of us in some categories. Um, and the schools continue to go down and down and down. And there's a reason for it, I think. But here's what the result is. In according to the nation's report card, which reports is an overview of testing, uh, in eighth grade, only 16% of African Americans are proficient in reading. That's fewer than 1 in 5, 1 in 6. Um, and in math, it's only 13% is proficient. How can people ever negotiate their way through our complex society if they are not proficient in reading and math? Now, I can also point out that it's not so hot. It's not so hot for the whites either. And in reading for whites, it was 44%, and math was 43%. So a lot higher than blacks, but the whites are not doing very well either. And there are curriculum that produce much better results. There's a researcher at the University of Columbia, Dr. Sarah Cohodes, Dr. Anna Igoliti in North Carolina State. Have been writing about this. It's called the No Excuses curriculum, but it's only implemented in a few New York City and Boston charter schools. Public schools will they'll never adopt it because the teachers' unions are not going to let them do it. The teachers' unions don't want that because it requires greater supervision of the teacher or heavier training for the teacher. It requires the teacher to interact one-on-one for extensive periods with individual students. And the teachers' unions are not going to go along with it. Just as the teachers' unions are always saying, well, we should always pay teachers more. Well, my attitude is we should pay excellent teachers should get excellent salaries, but the teachers' unions won't agree with that. They don't agree that if there is an excellent teacher, they should be paid more. They don't agree that if a teacher wants to work in a disadvantaged school and is dedicated to do that, that teacher could earn more money. Here, where I live, there was the school district wanted that, and the teachers' unions fought it, and it was everybody's paid the same. It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter how good you are. It doesn't matter if you're working in a disadvantaged school. You get paid the same. So the opposition is just too strong, and the political power of the teachers' unions is so enormous that I'm pessimistic. I do not think we're going to have equality.
Well, let me come in here to rain on your parade even more because as someone who's been teaching, in the New York City system, I taught for almost about 8 years, and I've been teaching in general for 15 years. Right now, I teach at the community college level, but I've taught students as young as 3 and as old as 73. And so, I agree with you about some of it. I think that the teachers' union is not the biggest problem, I have to say, although I do think that the teachers' union is a big problem. And I think the bigger problem in education right now is corruption in the form of the mismanagement of funds. Now, I think that if that problem, which is a little bit easier to solve than curriculum problems and teacher training problems, which I also believe are not the biggest issues in education as well. I think there are quite a large number of excellent teachers out there. I think that most teachers are good teachers, in fact, who are working teachers. The problem is teachers have to follow guidelines, right, that are handed down to them. When you say something like this new curriculum that would be introduced it would require teachers to spend all this time with individual students. That's what actually teachers want to do. But like, unfortunately, we're told we can't do that because we have to get certain results for the school and they want us to get these results in certain ways. And so really teachers are kind of hamstrung in a lot of cases. As someone who tried to promote a lot of curriculum and policy reform in schools throughout New York City and continuing in the North Carolina system, um, yeah, it's administrators at the principal and superintendent level and the politicians above them who are making decisions about financing. They are not thinking in that frame of mind whatsoever. They're not really trying to make improvements. They're trying to sustain what already exists, right? And so what we really need is a big shift in priorities, not just from the teachers union to kind of look at the current scenario in education a little bit more clearly and a little bit more presently instead of focusing on a lot of issues from the past. We need to look at our declining system and how we can kind of stop that decline. And I think step one is dealing with the corrupt practices of those who are in charge of allocating funds. And unfortunately, in most cases, it has to do with politics. So, yeah.
Well, I think I can concede a good bit of what you just said, and I don't dispute it. What I want to do though is I want to point and point your attention, Will, to and I talk about this in the book also in the last chapter. That the curriculum Dr. Cahotis is talking about, she says produces really some pretty dramatic results over a period of about 3 years. That the test gap between Black and white students virtually disappears. And so, I think there's a huge amount more of research. Just as I'm not an expert on slavery, I'm not an expert on education.
Well,
So
I kind of am.
you are,
let me tell you a little bit more, right? Like, so I hear what you're saying about those results. I believe them wholeheartedly. But like, one thing to understand is that curriculums and programs like this have been being created for a long time, right? And that showed promise, the same kind of promise. The issue is, and I think that you explained this before when we were talking privately, is that it's not going to be implemented, right? And part of the reason why it's not going to be implemented, and I think that a lot of people don't make this connection, it has to do with money. It has to do with who is being earmarked to allow their curriculum to go into schools. There's a pipeline for all of that. Same way there's a pipeline for assessment and the assessment tools that we use. For instance, I'm developing a new type of mathematics assessment that I think will significantly shrink the testing gap between all students. I think it will radically change people's perception of mathematics, the way that we teach mathematics, and it will make the mathematics teacher's job easier. But I know that I can't go through the system in order to propagate that assessment tool because there are like 3-4 companies who control all assessment throughout the nation. And so it's a complicated situation, but I really think that money is the number one driver of why these revolutionary curriculums and these new educational ideas that are based on what's best for our current generation of students are not being implemented.
Well, I mean, let's uh, let, let's just put it this way: if we want to, uh, there's a lot of talk about reparations this and reparations that, and I personally don't have a lot of confidence in just giving a bunch of money to people who haven't been well educated on how to manage it. I mean, I can see a lot of fly by night fraudsters taking advantage of those people and taking their money away from them as soon as they get it.
100%.
What I would rather have is I would rather have people educated, and that means not only, I mean, we've let people down. we've let people down from the very beginning. And when I say African Americans have never had the opportunity, it's of course through slavery. It's the period after Reconstruction, all the way up to the present, even after Brown versus Board of Education, and even today, still don't have the opportunity. That these results that I'm talking about right here are dismal. They're tragic. How can people survive if they can't read and write, if they're not proficient? And so few are proficient. Um, and uh, uh, but we haven't done it. The schools want to blame the parents. We hear all the time. Well, the single parent families and this and that, and that is an issue, which is it's another area that I want to talk about. But the it, it the schools let those people down. They let those parents down, and their parents. They let the grandparents down. So how are the parents going to be helping the students out at home if the parents themselves didn't get a good education?
It was one of the first questions I asked my administrators in my second year of teaching. That's when I first started trying to implement some reforms to our practices, which included classes for parents as well, so that we could show them how to help their kids more, which was an idea that was looked down upon.
Well, there's one more area, and I don't mention this at all in my book, but I think there's another area that is an area of concern. And by the way, I talked about the police, and there's no excuses for the police for some of this police behavior, but we can correct all of that, but it's still not going to give people incomes, and it's not going to help them build wealth. One area that is preventing the formation of families is the incarceration of so many young men, young women too, but especially young men, so that they cannot be fathers. And in particular, the drug laws. This is ridiculous, to put people in jail for something that ought to be a public health concern instead of a law enforcement concern, is ridiculous. And we have such a high rate of incarceration of these young men. When they get out, they can't get jobs easily. They've lost years from their lives. They haven't had a good education, and now and their children don't even know them. I think that is a major area that we need to pay attention to, and it does relate to education. It does relate to. It's too much for a young woman who gets pregnant in her teenage years to try to earn money to take care of her baby and or children, and probably working two jobs, and it's just too much. They can't do it. You need to. It would help a lot to have the young men.
Absolutely. There's so many issues we could go talk about. We got 10 minutes left. I want you to be able to talk about whatever last topics that you want to talk about with that 10 minutes. So what would you like to focus on for that time?
Well, I don't know. Um, let's see. I'll talk a little bit about some of the state laws that are being enacted. um, I think that the state legislatures may find themselves disappointed. I think there's some major First Amendment issues with some of these laws, such as, and one of the things that I really focus on is prohibiting a teacher from teaching a subject that makes somebody feel guilty. Now, I
just,
don't know
just
whether
for
anybody
just
needs to be feel needs
just
to feel guilty.
hang on,
I
hang on,
think
Edward, hang on. Just for viewer background, so that people understand what laws you're talking about, right? So, right now, there's all these state laws being enacted under the moniker of a CRT ban, critical race theory ban. Several states have put forth these bans, and so Edward is reading from the text of some of these laws.
well, yes, I mean, first of all, I don't. People don't actually know what critical race theory is. I have no idea after all of this debate. I mean, I think I have an idea about. I mean, it sounds like something for a law school, uh, studying how some of the laws in America are quote systemically racist or something. Um, I think I mean I'm not willing to say that all of American society is systemically racist. I'm not, but I do think we've just identified some things that are systemically racist. I think incarceration of so many young men for minor drug offenses. I think that's a systemic problem. I think education is a systemic problem. And I think police training is a systemic problem. I'm not talking about defunding police. I'm talking about police training. I think those are all systemic problems. So we can identify some specific things, but you don't need to teach that in K to 12 schools. I mean, that sounds to me like something more for a law school or for an education school. But these laws, they don't actually. I mean, they seemingly are attacking critical race theory, but they say that you can't teach history in a way that will make people feel uncomfortable. Well, how are you going to talk about posting slaves' heads along a road without making people feel uncomfortable? How are you going to talk about burning slaves at the stake without or whipping them, uh, uh, giving them lashes till the blood runs? How are you going to do that? How are you going to talk about breaking up families if you don't? I mean, some people are going to feel uncomfortable. There may be some people who feel guilty that they're not doing it now. I don't know why they would feel guilty, but they do. They ought to say, hey, okay, now I can understand why Joe or Martha over here are upset. I can understand what they're upset about now a little bit better. Um, they there was in Texas that it says here. This is a opinion piece that was published today or yesterday in the New York Times. It says that Texas Public Policy Foundation, a conservative think tank, uh, published a list of concepts that help identify critical race theory in the classroom, including the terms social justice, colonialism, and identity. Really? We can't talk about colonialism in a high school classroom? And are people serious about this?
Oh, they're dead serious,
I,
man.
I I think, yeah, we have a conservative Supreme Court, but they're very much on board with the First Amendment. They are real fans of the First Amendment. And if you're going to say you can't talk about colonialism or social justice in the classroom, I think they're going to have problems with that.
100%. Absolutely. We'll see, we'll see how this landscape evolves. I have no idea what's about to happen. I think that these laws are inconsequential. I think they're largely, um, I mean, they're, I think, facially unconstitutional, as you just said. So I'm not really concerned about um, their implementation. What I'm concerned about is the fact that the political will was gathered so quickly to create these laws and try to put them into codify them into the law. I think that that's what worries me: the speed, the collaboration of effort that it took, the fact that random guys could just say that they were critical race theory experts and then start trashing it. And these people ended up in the halls of Congress working on this legislation.
Well, it's the slave society reasserting itself. This is, attitudes are passed down from grandparents to parents to children to grandchildren. They're subtle. I think it's good for us to be aware of that ourselves. I've tried to be aware of it myself. In my case, my parents, I think, were not avid racists. They were activists on the other side, but they were avid racists. I'd like to. Maybe we have 3 or 4 minutes. Maybe I can wrap up with a little bit from Frederick Douglass and his speech.
All right, please do.
All right. First, I want to point out a couple of things that he said. First of all, he emphasized the Declaration of Independence. He said, "I have said that the Declaration of Independence is the ring bolt to the chain of your nation's destiny. So indeed I regard it. The principles contained in that instrument are saving principles. Stand by those principles, be true to them on all occasions, in all places, against all foes, and at whatever cost." I think that we should point to the Declaration of Independence as a foundation document. And I think that with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments in effect, the Declaration of Independence was put into the Constitution. Its basic principles were. He also praised the signers of the Declaration of Independence to some extent. Fellow citizens, I'm not wanting in respect for the fathers of this republic. The signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men. They were great men too, great enough to give fame to a great age. It does not often happen to a nation to raise at one time such a number of truly great men. The point from which I'm compelled to view them is not certainly the most favorable, yet I cannot contemplate their great deeds with less than admiration. They were statesmen, patriots, and heroes, and for the good they did and the principles they contended for, I will unite with you to honor their memory. But then he goes on in the speech. He gives a very graphic description of a slave coffle, and this is what he says about America. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings with all your religious parade and solemnity are to a slave mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour. Go where you may, search where you will, roam through all the monarchies and despotisms of the old world, travel through South America, search out every abuse, and when you have found the last, lay your facts by the side of the everyday practices of this nation, and you will say with me that for revolting barbarity and shameless hypocrisy, America reigns without a rival.
Wow. Well, there you go. I think that's a really good quote on which to end it. So, Edward, I just want to say thank you so much for agreeing to be on the show to share with us your research on slavery and sharing Frederick Douglass' words with us. Really appreciate you being here. So thank you so much.
Well, Will, thank you very much for having me. I've enjoyed it thoroughly, and thank you again.